Controversy is not a common topic when it comes to One Piece. In general, the One Piece fandom tends to be a pretty chill one. You know, we tend to hate information in stride, and then we tend to go ahead and start incorporating new theories or just discussing what our favorite parts of it is. But a topic has been gaining a lot of circulation recently about whether or not Luffy actually works hard or he's gifted, and I've seen it come up quite a bit. And while a lot of people like to say Luffy is either gifted or he just, has both, I think it's a little bit more complicated than either of those answers, so I'm gonna say you don't know Luffy. I think the reason that a lot of people tend to say that Luffy is just gifted has to do with his specific devil fruit plus some family lineage issues. So let's go ahead and address his devil fruit, because fundamentally today a lot of people say Luffy is gifted because his devil fruit is the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika, which of course grants him all the abilities of the sun god, the literal warrior of liberation. And while I can understand that some people see that as a big up, there's a thing to be attached to that as well. Mainly the fact that for almost 1,000 chapters, Luffy did not have Nika. He had the Gum Gum fruit, and while I know he didn't technically swap it, for the longest time, rubber was his only ability. Meaning that for most of his run, Luffy was essentially Mr. Fantastic without the IQ. That's really important to keep in mind because it really reshapes a lot of the feats that people tend to go back on and say, was that Nika influencing it? It wasn't. He doesn't unlock Nika until Wano. So that is Luffy purely exercising his fairly abundant creativity. And obviously the second aspect of Luffy's power that a lot of people tend to go about that he's gifted is his haki. Now a lot of people tend to downplay his haki because of who his family is. In particular, the fact that his dad is Dragon, which doesn't really make much sense. We don't have very many feats from Dragon other than he's the leader of the Revolutionary Army. And then there's the fact that Garp is his grandpa. And yes, Garp might very well be the second strongest haki user in the series total, right behind Roger, but the simple fact of the matter is the fact he's related to Luffy does not mean Luffy inherited that power. And we know this because it's not exactly like Kid Luffy was busting out galaxy impacts when he was fighting mountain bandits. And Kid Luffy is actually a good place to take this next section because we have to talk about just how hard Luffy actually worked to gain his power, starting with the fact that while we start at his 17 marker where he has a fairly decent control over his abilities, that's not where his story began. He ate the Gomu Gomu no Mi at 7 years old and trained for 10 years to master it, which of course, to be fair, wasn't really mastering. In essence, he trained 10 years to basically get to level 1 with his ability, and that level cannot be understated because we look at characters like Momo who essentially have an arguably stronger base fruit in the form of his dragon fruit, but he can't use it properly. Even essentially after having gained his full size and form, he still can't use all of the dragon's abilities, and even when he does unlock things like Blast Breath, he can't control them very well. And keep in mind, those first 10 years were spent purely training the Gum Gum fruit. He had to spend basically another couple months in his journey in the Grand Line mastering even more moves as he encountered more and stronger enemies, coming up with some really out there ways for him to be able to fully use that ability. And then if you want to stack training on top of it, think about the fact that it took him 2 years to achieve a, well, remarkable level of haki. It was not the pinnacle of what haki could be. It's also worth noting that while he took this time to also blend his haki with his devil fruit, he didn't have a full grasp on how to make them interact properly, which is why we have Bounce Man. An incredibly powerful upgrade, but one that rapidly drains his haki and more often than not never actually lasts a full battle. Meaning when it's deployed, he will actually need to take a break somewhere in the middle so he can actually recover. And it isn't even until Wano that he learns Ryuo, and then that eventually paves his way for unlocking the majority of Nika. But of course, all of this tends to fly pretty far in the face when most people look at the fact that it's pretty heavily implied Luffy is a born chosen one. And there is a lot of ample evidence for this. There are records on poneglyphs indicating that somebody will come back. We know that the Sea Kings talk about the fact that when their princess is about to be born, they say that another will be born in another sea and they will meet, which is also then referenced within the lines of the Harley on Elbath. And then there's the fact that the world government itself, in the form of the 5 elders, basically say that Hito Hito no Mi model Nika is way more sentient than most fruits, especially even zone fruit, stating that at almost every turn the fruit seems to thwart them or fight them, and that would seem to indicate that it can also choose who is the one that wields it. A fact that's even more illuminated by the fact that, like, if you look at the live action series, which they collaborated with Oda on, we know that it seems to very much pull Luffy in, which does seem to happen in the original, but it's also sitting on the counter near Luffy, so that might have just been attributed to an object permanence thing. But no, in most versions now it's heavily more implied that it probably did draw on Luffy, sensing that he would make a good host for its power. And yeah, Luffy does come from a very prestigious family. He is A, of the D clan, and B, the grandson of a vice admiral who probably could have been fleet admiral or world general, and the direct son of the chief founding member of the Revolutionary Army and the world's worst criminal, Dragon. So I do get why people say that Luffy was born gifted, but there is one thing that really beats this out in terms of the entire story of One Piece, and that is that Luffy isn't actually a chosen one. I know, right? It's kind of funny because so much time and evidence is spent on showing us that Luffy is chosen in some particular way, and in one unique way he is definitely by Nika. But it's very much worth noting that that chosen one status, the one about the fruit picking him, that is because of who Luffy fundamentally is, not because of what he was born as. Luffy has always valued freedom. It has always been one of his tenets. Even when he misunderstood what the point of being a pirate was, the reason he wanted to join Shanks was because of the freedom that being a pirate allowed. If anything, really, the freedom that Shanks showed him was a freedom that didn't just exist for one's own sake, but basically existed for others, which might have very well influenced Nika to actually pick Luffy. Do keep in mind that originally Roger might very well have been a candidate for this as well had Nika been around when he was around, although him being sick might have also been a contender against this. But that did leave, obviously, Shanks the idea that Ace could have served as the host for this particular fruit, and that's pretty well founded as well. Because when you think about it, what was required for Nika was the idea of liberation, and while Shanks was a very angry kid, he definitely did believe in a lot of aspects of loyalty and trust. That essentially formed the very bedrock of the foundation of his relationship with Luffy and Sabo. Now, do I think that Ace could have actually unlocked Nika's full potential? Maybe. He is definitely a strong character, but it's worth noting that a few things work against him. For one thing, just how generally angry he was probably would have worked against that, but there were some other considerations as well. Like the fact that he never seems to spend very much time training his haki, as well as the fact that his form of liberation doesn't seem to be as direct tied with the idea of freedom for all, although we do get a brief glimpse of this on Wano, so there's a possibility that it could have worked. At the end of the day, the reason that Nika chose Luffy was not because of who he was born to, and not because of any existential factors involving a prophecy. It was more than likely simply because he was free. He seeks that freedom for others. I think it's really worth noting that not even a year after Shanks would end up leaving the island and giving Luffy his straw hat, the same dream he would tell Ace and Sabo is apparently the same one that Roger had. Nearly 20 years before him, and a man whose legacy at best is distantly related to Luffy, and yet somehow he did have that same feeling. In many ways, this indicates that multiple people could have actually been Nika's host, but it was Luffy who ended up picking up the mantle. And yes, there are factors that work around Luffy being very lucky, or perhaps being guided by something, perhaps multiple somethings if you look at throughout the trajectory of the series. But there is also no denying the fact that Luffy has worked incredibly hard to get where he is, and ultimately the reason he is there is because he chose it. He was not chosen by someone else, he was given the powers of something that basically thought he might muster its full potential, not even necessarily disclosing what that potential was to be used for. With some of the reveals on Elbaf, it's impossible to say that Nika was also even absolutely pure and good of heart, some of the indications being that he was also a god of destruction, and ultimately it would be Luffy's choice as to how that power would be used. Is Luffy a chosen one? Yes, but only because of the choices that he himself have made. If you like this Luffy video, go ahead and check out my theory on Enel that explains that he might very well have been the first Lunarian in the series. Don't forget to like and subscribe and debate with me in the comments so we can boost the YouTube algorithm on this.